Previously on InnerZension Radio.
So we get different messages along the way that we then start to limit and make ourselves smaller and less than what we really are. And those are forms of imprisonment. And so in this work, we allow ourselves to release some of those messages or constructs that we got and allow ourselves to actually see what they are.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Chris McClary with another episode of InnerZension Radio. And in this module, we're going to be going up to New Jersey through Skype and talking with a therapist who's been a social worker and helping out clients for over 4 decades. And the way this happened, we connected on LinkedIn, and I noticed that he had a book that I had not really ever considered to be that important. It was on self-compassion, and I decided to get the book. And when I began reading it, I couldn't believe how many references to the words inner peace were in that book, and everything clicked. Everything made sense. He had me convinced that this self-compassion, or his views on it, are going to be one of the main pillars to InnerZension. And so I had to get him on the radio show, and he obliged. He's also a Temple University professor, so we couldn't be more proud to have someone of Nate's caliber come on to InnerZension Radio and give us a big download of all the things that he's experienced over the past 40 years. Now, this conversation got so deep that we decided to go ahead and record a second show. So, keep checking back. If you liked this show, you're really going to like the next one called Suffering, and it's going to be at some undisclosed time period in probably the spring. And we really look forward to publishing that one as well. And anyway, here's our conversation. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show. We have with us a very, very experienced therapist, Nate Terrell, licensed social worker for over 40 years. He's up in New Jersey. He's been training self-compassion through his company and through Temple University. He's a great teacher. He's an author as well, author of Achieving Self-Compassion, Giving Yourself the Gifts of Happiness and Inner Peace. And it's going to be linked in the show notes, so be sure to get a copy of this book. It will teach you all the portals into self-compassion. And so far in my extensive career of research and reading books, I have yet to read a book that has as many direct references to the words inner peace as Nate, your book. And so it's absolutely perfect for InnerZension, because what we want is a state of inner contentment that doesn't go away. It's not very volatile. It doesn't depend on outside influences. And correct me if I'm wrong, but self-compassion sounds like it's going to be one of those pillars to inner peace, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Welcome to the show, Nate. I'm honored to have you on. Thanks for coming to talk to us. And as you introduce yourself, if you're willing to, talk about how these kids, it's strange how, even though they're young, inexperienced, how it seems like they can offer you some not just meaningful insights, but life-changing insights when they're not even really trying to help you. And it sounds like that's what happened to you. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I grew up in a Quaker family where there was a lot of emphasis put on helping other people, doing volunteer work, etc. I never thought a whole lot about self-compassion and taking good care of myself. And at times I would get overwhelmed or stressed out. And my wife and I adopted our son when he was 9. And early on, he really needed all of my care and all of my attention. But when he was 14, 15 years old, we were going through a difficult time in our relationship. And we were driving in my car, and I was stunned when he said to me, "You know what I hate the most about you, Dad?" And I said, "What's that, buddy?" He said, "You think you can make me happy? You think you can take away all of my angst? You think you can make me see the world the way you see the world?" And I looked at him and I said, "Of course, I love you. I'll do anything for you." And he said in no uncertain terms, "Well, you can't." He said, "This is my pain. This is my past." He had a lot of difficulties in his past, a lot of trauma, a lot of foster homes, etc. And he said, "This is my responsibility." And I think with a tear in my eye, I said, "What should I do?" And he said, in colorful language, which I won't use on this radio show, he said, "Why don't you leave me alone and focus on taking care of yourself?" And you know what? He was right. And I started to do it. And it really has changed my life. And that's what I want to focus on today. I started being my own best friend. I started setting better boundaries with other people. I started meditating, exercising more, doing things I loved. And my epiphany was, and this is what I really want to share with you and listeners, the better I felt about myself, the more I was my own best friend, the more I was filled with an abundance of peace, love, happiness, abundance that I could pass on to other people. Now, a lot of people think it's selfish to be self-compassionate. And of course, it's selfish to take other people's stuff or be mean-spirited. But there's nothing selfish about being good to yourself. And I really credit my son for sharing that lesson with me. And he has to remind me of that sometimes.
How old was he when he gave you that epiphany?
I guess he was about 15 years old. It was about 6 years ago. He was about 15 years old.
Really insightful, and it almost sounds like, I've seen family dynamics where you have this giving person, just a total self-sacrificer, and they start getting resentful because they're either not getting the thank yous in return, or they're not getting the same amount of effort in response to it, and the resentment in that service-oriented person actually starts to grow and fester. Is that something that maybe he was picking up on? He might have been picking up on the unconscious resentment that you were having, possibly?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I never really thought about that, Chris. But I think you're absolutely right, and you are right in what you're saying. As much as we all want to be Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King, we're all human beings. We're not saints. We can work hard to be loving, kind people, but we, clearly, when we give and give and give and don't get back what we're giving out, or don't take care of ourselves, yes, resentment does build up. And I see this in families. You see this in families all the time. And this is why it's really a gift to other people to be self-compassionate, because then we don't resent them. If we take great care of ourselves, the analogy I use in my book is, if our food pantry is filled up to the point where food is coming out of the doors and windows, and our neighbor comes by and asks for some food, we're happy to give some. If our pantry's empty and we take the last, scrap of bread and give it to them, it's really difficult on a deeply human level not to feel like, wow, is this really fair? Even if we feel like we don't deserve self-compassion, we owe it to the world to be self-compassionate, because then we have more to give other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in one group, it was the same kind of conversation, not associated with self-compassion per se, but just the service-minded. It is related, and what I came up with was a similar analogy, but kind of like just a glass of water. If my glass is only 10% full, can I really give 100%? I don't even
Absolutely.
have the resources to give 100. I can only give 10% because that's all I have. And I'm almost thinking that if there's in this service-oriented thing, and of course, we're not talking about don't ever be of service. I want to make that clear, because we're going to have other shows that talk about the other extreme, which is get out there and be of service to others. But it's almost like we need both extremes. In a balanced world, I've heard this over and over again, where you need to take the middle road, and I don't like that. I think we do need the extremes. If we breathe, we're breathing in and breathing out to the extremes, and it feels the best when we're in those extremes. And there's a lot more creativity and so on. But if we're just giving because we should be giving, it doesn't come out right. And I think that if you're giving yourself the gift of self-compassion and getting your bank account full, or getting not literal bank account, but your enjoyment and happiness cup full, then you have a lot more to give, but just giving freely without this attachment of should. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a concept I love called discerning compassion, which means it doesn't make sense. You're not going to go to the mall and hand out all your money. Or if you did, I would hope somebody would say, can you really afford that? We only have so much to give to the world, and we have to be careful about how we give it. If we allow one situation, one person to drain all of our energy, that's not fair to maybe other people. I was saying this to a client the other day. Think of your inner potential for giving and loving and caring as a finite resource to the extent that you can't just give and give and give exhaustively without replenishing yourself. And I also like the idea of the extremes. I throw myself into my work with my clients, counseling students at Temple, doing volunteer work sometimes. And I also am very tuned into my own inner sort of litmus test in terms of where I'm at. And then I love to go down to the woods. We have a family cabin in the Pine Barrens. I'll get down there and spend the night and just me, and I'll relish in that too. I like both those extremes. I know when I need to take a date with myself. I know when I need to sit and listen to my Hindu chanting and meditate. I know when I need to say to my wife, listen, I've just had it. I'm not going to speak to anybody for the next day or two if I don't have to. So I appreciate what you're saying about extremes. That's absolutely true.
And I think this isn't really into your book. I want to get into your book after this, but it's almost like there's like a special well that I've figured out, at least in my life, where it's a bottomless well, and it's like your gift, your talent, your gift, and when you're giving that, it tends to never run out. I think. And if you're giving anything else that you're trying to generate, it seems like it just generates a decrease in energy, or it steals energy. It rapes you of energy. If you're giving anything that's not really like your special gift, and it's not just money, definitely, it's probably not something material, something for me more thoughtful, like in counseling sessions and problem solving. And so anyway, I think if we just limit our gift giving to the things that are really talented and special about ourselves, I think you'll find that it's not tapping your energy so much.
Absolutely. Great point.
Took me a while to get that out, but let's get into your book. And there's so much to talk about in your book. I've got lots and lots of notes. I'm not going to go in any particular order of importance. Just some of these notes that I found was really interesting about the skill of these practices that you talked about. Like in this case, practicing having a negative reaction to less significant events in our lives that respond to with annoyance and frustration, and instead practicing the skill of not responding in a negative way. And it's almost like a muscle. But in any way, talk about how the mechanics of, say, you're faced with a frustrating event, and how typical it is of us to just impulsively go slam the door or lash out or act out in passive aggressive ways. Talk about the alternative to that.
Yeah. What I suggest to clients and what I practice within myself is the minute we feel physiologically that we're going to be reactive. Some people have, tightness in their chest. Some people feel redness in their cheeks. I encourage them to visualize that there's a string between the outside event and their inward reaction. And I encourage them to cut that string. Or another analogy is I visualize a garage door slamming down. When I was a kid, my dad had a garage door that was metal and would come sort of crashing down. That may sound like a violent image, but I had a terrible temper for a lot of my life. My dad had a terrible temper. And what I did with my temper was every single time I felt like I was going to be reactive, I just visualized this garage door coming down. And of course, through neuroplasticity, as you say, every single time we respond differently, we're actually literally rewiring our brains. This isn't just some esoteric concept. The thought or the feeling goes up the neuron, and then if we're able to stop it, the neuron loses its strength and loses the impact. the anger part of our brain is like a muscle, and the less we go there, the less brain matter there is. I mean, this is very neurological, obviously, but I just practiced it over and over and over and over again. The other thing I do whenever I have a negative reaction, or I'm anxious or worried or ruminating, is I just ask myself, can I do something about this? The old serenity prayer. And then if I can't, I visualize letting it go. I leave the attic of my mind. I visualize all the wires of my mind running around in tangles. And I visualize a trapdoor opening up. And I fall down through that trapdoor into this river of compassion and peace. Sometimes it's hard to get there if I'm not feeling well, if I'm really stressed out, etc. But it really helps me, as I'm in this deeper place within me, I look at the world and it's more like events. Now, obviously, I wish for good events for all of us, but when we're really deep inside ourselves, obviously we're less reactive. I tell my clients, imagine you're on the surface of the ocean and your life is going up and down based on the events in your life. And now imagine you're underneath the surface of the ocean and there's like a buffer. So it could be raining or storming or sunny on the outside, but we're not as impacted. Or I imagine, I say to clients, imagine you're in a car driving through a rainstorm. No matter what's happening on the outside, you're still protected in your inner peace. So I'm very practical with clients about these strategies, about going to the balcony and stepping back in difficult situations. The thing I find is challenging for people is they don't do enough of it. We all know to step back and count to 10. We've all heard that since we were in kindergarten. But we have to practice it over and over and over and over again to rewire our reactions and rewire our brains. Does that sound realistic to you? I mean, obviously, if there's life situations where it's really hard to do that. If somebody's racist towards you or disrespectful, I'm not saying it's always possible. I certainly have moral outrage sometimes when I hear about mean things happening in the world. But does what I'm saying sound possible to you, or does it sound unrealistic in some way?
It is a habit. Our reactions are habits to what we've always known. We first start watching other people, our parents acting, and we see that as just normal. So we start carrying out the same kind of activity. Right. And it's kind of like smoking a cigarette. You don't even realize you're pulling it out of the packet and starting to light it. All these you don't know that you're turning the wheel as you're driving the car. It's just all very unconscious action. And it's a split second. So in that split second, there's a kind of a phase where you see an outside trigger, which triggers you to a past experience, most likely, which could be way back when, but it's all unconscious, which triggers a automatic behavioral response, either kind of more most likely fight or flight. Right. And the anger outburst, or flee and leave, or dissociate, or do something that's probably feels like a coping skill if you look at it in hindsight. Right. But it's all unconscious, and you can't get to Wimbledon by being conscious. It has to these wicked serves and fast balls going back and forth have to be these all your swings, all your assessments have to be split second and unconscious. Yes. Or else you're just not going to get there. So my point is, yes, but you have to practice it. You have to. And in fact, they did a study with basketball players, and half the people weren't allowed to do any free throws. They just had to imagine the free throws. And apparently the people who did the best were the ones who did a little bit of practice, but they also did the imagination of making the basket. And so we need to imagine ourselves being in that flow, even in very stressful moments, even when we're clearly being triggered. And then we'll get into that kind of that repression mode, which, if we do this habit practice, they say practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. Right. But in your book, you talk about being perfect, and there's kind of there's an unrealistic bar that's being set with perfectionism, which I like that. But in this case, we need to practice it perfectly in order to get the best responses. And the opposite of, like lashing out would be just to repress it and stuff it down. And so talk a little bit about the bad aspects of just pretending it doesn't exist.
Right.
And what are the long-term consequences of that?
Well, certainly, and I'm sure you say the same thing to individuals or couples you work with, it's important to say stuff. I mean, the whole point is not to repress or stifle down all of your reactions, but just be able to say what you're thinking and feeling in as calm a way as possible. So this isn't about denying our emotions or our thoughts or our feelings or our needs. It's about being able to communicate them in a way that doesn't blow people away and in a way that's not unfair. Probably one of the biggest challenges of being a therapist is, particularly in working with people that have gone through trauma, is to make sure that they have ample time and space and opportunities to share their pain, to share their loss, to share that we've been through. I would never say to somebody who just lost their child in a car accident, oh, la-di-da, be happy and don't be upset. That would be cruel.
Right.
I had a client, young man I've been seeing whose father died a couple of years ago, and he always came into the session so cheerful and happy. And every time I asked him about any upset emotions, he said, oh, I can deal with anything. But clearly he was repressing a lot of his upsetness about his father's death. He had grown up in a family where you were never supposed to talk about emotions. And finally, I looked him directly in the eye and I said, you need to talk about it. And 2 minutes later, I'm handing him my entire box of tissues. I mean, he had a lot to say. So the caveat in really of all of what we're talking about, what I'm saying today is when people are really suffering from significant trauma, whether it's war, whether it's sexual abuse, child abuse, any sort of violence, sometimes they just need to cry or to let it out. And I would never want to deny anybody their emotions. And part of the self-compassion is to accept that, to not beat up on oneself for feeling strong emotions, to allow yourself to do that. And while I'm working with these people that have been traumatized, I'll often say to them, look, you can come here as long as you want and talk as long as you want about your pain, what you've been through, but let me know when you feel you're ready to make a switch into letting some of it go or putting it in a box in the attic of your mind or being more mindful and meditating and finding other ways to deal with things. I'm working with a woman who has 3 children and 2 of them died of heroin overdoses in the last 6 months. And after we spent a lot of time talking about her trauma, she said, I don't want this to be the only thing I ever think about. So we actually have done a lot of visualization. And it's possible for her to feel the pain of the loss of her 2 children who she loved dearly, and at the same time, find some peace in the moment. Take great care of herself. Set boundaries with people who aren't supportive and sensitive. And she's made radical changes in her life. She left her job because it was too painful to go back, and people either avoided her or cried when they saw her. But it's a delicate balance. How do you work, and when you're working with clients that have been traumatized, how do you find the balance between letting them express their thoughts, their feelings, their trauma, but not drowning in it, not letting it define their entire lives?
Well, I think it's so important to see where they are in that stage. And from an ACT therapy standpoint, there's kind of 6 areas, and I can't even say that. I was going to rule out 2 of them, like values and committed action, and probably go with how do you feel right now? And that gets us started with separating who you are as a person from the actual emotion that's running through you.
Exactly.
So it's not something that I'm trying to get rid of. And then the other piece is acceptance, like you said, accepting the fact that something happened and accepting the fact that I'm feeling this emotion. Those 2 are very strong in this, her first initial trauma experience in therapy. And in fact, in your book, if we can progress into worry, you had some really good suggestions. I think I like this. At the end of each chapter, you have try this on or try these things out. And in this one, you said, whenever you are caught up in worrying, ask yourself if there is something you can do about what you are worrying about. So in other words, right there tells you that the worry is almost giving you a gift of, hey, there's something more that you should be doing here. So go do it. But if there is something to do, but if there is nothing you can do, let your worries go.
Absolutely.
And that's,
I'm sorry, were you finished?
I love that. Yeah, I have more to say about it, but go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your sentence.
So in ACT therapy, they would say that let your worry go would be a little bit, there would be a lot more mechanics to that. In fact, the strict ACT therapist would say you can't let it go. It's always going to be there. And but in the real way in our world to let worry go is to actually experience it. Let it be there. Let it be there until and be with it so deeply that it starts to devolve. It starts to let go of the grasp.
Yes, and that's certainly, I certainly talk a lot about that with clients, but I also say to them, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't have your worry, you didn't have your anxiety? Because people have this belief, and you and I may see this a little bit differently, people have this misconception that their worry will somehow protect them. And the biggest jump that I find that people really need to make, and I wish I'd written more about this in my book, I've sort of discovered this since I've wrote the book, is that they're afraid to take the risk of letting go of their worry, their anxiety, their fear, their rumination, because they believe they need those things to somehow protect them. And the only way they're ever going to really be truly convinced that they don't need those things is to experiment with letting them go. And what I find, of course,
love that.
And a lot of my clients have found this, that you can find as much inner peace as possible. You can have an inner serenity, and you can still wear your seatbelt and go to the dentist and, not jump out of airplanes without a parachute. And you don't really need it. And what I experience, at least in my own life, particularly since I've discovered this beautiful river of inner peace within me, is I'm more functional. I remember what needs to get done. I plan. I think ahead of time. I'm not just scattershot running through life without any sense of safety or self-protection. But we need to prove it to ourselves by letting go of the worry. Another visualization that I use a lot is that I say to people that I imagine I'm standing in a big room, and all of my stories, my past, my narratives, my worries are all like playing like those old-fashioned movie projectors, like on all the walls. I can choose to focus on them, my inner voice, the real me that can make that choice. I can choose to pull anything up, but I can also choose not to look at those stories. I could choose to go within. I could choose to meditate. I could choose to turn the volume of those stories down. You're right that it's sometimes hard to get rid of it. If we try too hard to get rid of it, it almost takes more life on. But I say to people, imagine these worries are knocking at your door, and you say to them, like, not today. Or you give yourself a half hour to experience it. I worked with a guy years ago whose wife had an affair with his best friend, had left him, and he was filled with rage. And I said to him, can you take 10 minutes out of every day and just let yourself feel all of it, but then recognize that it's not really helping you get to a better place in your life. So sometimes you have to experience it in spurts. But I like the idea of these projectors playing because we can't always turn them off, but we cannot focus on them. I read a book called The Untethered Soul a couple of years ago, and you may have seen this book. And it talked about, the untethered soul is when our inner voice can choose can know how free it is to choose to focus on whatever we want to focus on. And that's the mindfulness piece. Michael Singer is the author of that book. That's why I love the mindfulness so much. We can make those choices. We can't make all our bad memories go away, but we can choose to focus on the moment we're in. Is that clear? It's sort of an esoteric concept.
Oh, I love it. But it's in the here and now. It's very practical and pragmatic in my view. Is it helping you or not? I love that question.
Yeah. And what are you afraid would happen if you let it go? I mentioned to you earlier when we were chatting, my wife and I had a daughter 30 years ago who was born with a form of autism called Rett syndrome. And we were filled with fears about her future. Would she live independently? How to take care of her? And we went to a treatment program called the Option Institute in Massachusetts. And they asked us a question that changed my life. They asked us, what are you afraid would happen if you weren't upset about your daughter's situation? And I think I said to the woman, well, maybe if I wasn't upset, I wouldn't take care of her, or people would feel like I didn't care about her. Sometimes we feel like we have to be upset to show that we care.
Yes.
People feel like, oh, if they're upset about starvation in Syria, that somehow their upsetness is going to help those kids. The kids in Syria would be better off if you were totally happy and sent them some money. In any case, I realized our upsetness, my worry, my fear wasn't helping anybody. And that's really when I began to choose happiness. And of course, when I let go of the fear, I was much better able to be a resource to my daughter and a good husband to my wife and to be self-compassionate to myself. I ask that question a lot. I don't ask it glibly, or I don't ask it with people that are in the middle of trauma.
Right.
But it's a pretty profound question to say, what would happen if you gave up your anger? People often say, I had a very angry client years ago. He said, my anger is all I have in life. If you take that away, there's nothing to me. And I didn't try to take his anger away after he said that. But we feel like we need these primitive emotions. You mentioned the fight, flight, the limbic system. A lot of this stuff comes from 100,000 years ago. We're wired to respond to life's challenges with all this intense emotion. We don't really need it to take care of ourselves anymore. Life isn't a life and death battle every day between safety and danger. I mean, it could be, but it's really not. So but I am very practical in teaching my clients to use visualizations, to use meditation, to find this inner peace this place of inner peace within ourselves.
What are the limits to this question? Is this helping me or not? And can I let it go? So could you do that with depression? Could you do it with some of the mood instabilities?
Yeah. Yes. And first of all, I would find out how the depression is serving them. I say to people, I'm sure you say this to your clients, that all the behaviors, thoughts, perspectives that we develop served us in some way. They're not random. So we have to acknowledge how they've served us. We can't just rip them away from our clients. That would terrify our clients. For instance, the client that grew up, well, let's take an example. It's actually happened a couple of months ago. I worked with a woman who'd been tragically sexually molested when she was a very young child, and she developed a lot of rage, a lot of anger. She had a difficult life. She would often get in physical confrontations with people, and she came to me for therapy after having a lot of challenges and really believed there was something seriously wrong with her. In fact, she said to me, you're going to leave this field after talking to me for an hour. And I said, I don't think so. But in any case, I heard her story. And then I said, you don't need all of that anymore. That all of her behavior was an attempt to take care of herself and protect herself, her 3-year-old self. So in answer to your question, we need to credit the depression. Maybe the depression is what got them attention, or got them safety, or got them noticed.
Personify it.
Excuse me?
Personify it like another person almost.
Yes. How did it help you?
Mm-hmm.
And what are you afraid would happen if you let it go? Do you still need it? Maybe the child, the only way they got, any attention in school was to act out and throw things. Well, do you still need that at age 20 or whatever? So in response to your question, we need to validate the reasons people have the behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. We need to honor them, maybe give them a goodbye party, maybe write them a card out. I really appreciate your attempts to help me or rescue me or save me or protect me, but I don't need you as much anymore. Now, some people will say, well, I still need all of that. But then I'm very pragmatic in, well, what do you need to do to protect yourself that doesn't involve dysfunctional behaviors?
And what about the case where, no, I don't need this depression, but I can't get rid of it?
Right. Well, I guess I have worked with people with chronic long-term depression that they can't shake. And at that point, I help them see it as an ally, see it as a friend, and not to be angry about it. And of course, to find as much peace and happiness as possible. I don't mean to sound, like a silver lining or like this is easy. But if they really can't get rid of it, to accept it's there, and to recognize that maybe it's still trying to teach them lessons. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I would refer them to some doctors I know for medication. I would try meditation. I would try visualization. I would try teaching them positive self-talk and be their own best friend. But it in the long run, they're probably better off accepting maybe it's something they can't change and trying to live around it, if that makes any sense.
And looking at lifestyle choices, possibly. There's also some underlying medical issues that can look a lot like depression.
Well, absolutely. Thyroid problems, all sorts of things. Absolutely.
And so if you've done you feel like you've really, honestly, genuinely got in there with or without the therapist and accepted this let's just call it depression or anxiety, and you know very much why it was there, and you've created new action items to change your life, but yet it's still there. There could be an underlying medical issue.
Oh, absolutely. It could be an underlying medical issue. It could be a lot of different things. I mean, I do a lot with people on diet, I exercise, all the basic things. But so many people feel the depression, feel the sadness, but then beat up on themselves for feeling it.
Yeah. Like, how did I let this get out of control? It was my fault, and browbeat themselves.
And that's what I mean by not battling it anymore. Just accepting it as best they can and trying to work around it. It's hard to do. I mean, I feel for a lot of these people. I really do.
Okay, so now get into the discussion, because I have a different philosophy, not different than yours. I just a different model that is fairly new to the world that I'm going to be studying in my PhD. That one half of the model is called being, and this paragraph that I'm going to read out of your book, it kind of goes down that same road, and people on the outside would look and just say, well, if we got to choose to sit on the couch or go do stuff or just take care of ourselves, wouldn't we just quit our jobs and just go sit on the couch all day? And you cover this in your book. And you even said, if you don't mind me quoting you.
No, I'm honored.
I encourage my clients to take the risk of letting go of stress to prove themselves that it does not serve them in any way. I assure them that if their inner peace leads them to stay in the bed all day and ignore their responsibilities, they can always return to being stressed. However, this never happens.
Right.
And and that's exactly the same kind of thing that I talk about in my model, where if you're worried that you're going to just be sacking out on the bed all day and not get anything done, then you don't really understand what this concept of self-compassion or taking care of yourself or taking time out really means. Do you agree with
Absolutely.
that?
The people I know who have the deepest levels of self-compassion and inner peace are many of the most active people I know. Like, yes, some of them may choose to meditate and not be as involved in the outside world, which is, of course, their prerogative. But, it's people that lie on the couch all day long eating fast food and watching, TV. I'm not knocking, I'm not judging it. They're probably people who have some depression, who have some inertia, in their lives. And obviously I wouldn't want them to judge themselves for that. Maybe they need to take a day, a week, and sort of replenish. But again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but we give ourselves stress in large part because we feel like we need it. We need to get things done, to motivate ourselves, to mobilize ourselves. But we really don't. And people think they need to beat up on themselves emotionally to reach their goals or overcome mistakes they've made. But they don't need to. I mean, self-love, self-care, in my experience, never makes anybody complacent. When we are filled up with this wonderful abundance, we're compelled to volunteer work. We're compelled to service to others. We're compelled to good cheer. But as we talked earlier, we also know when we need to stop chatting with everybody and maybe go out to the woods and meet our own needs a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love all these concepts. Now, You have what, 12 portals
Yes.
of self-compassion. Do you want to share just a couple of those or some of your favorites?
Yeah. I often start with people by encouraging them just to talk to themselves like their own best friend. I talk to myself all day long sometimes. I love you, buddy. Hang in there. If I make a mistake, I'll just say, look, you messed up. Just don't do it again. I don't mean to sound cocky. I know I'm no better than anybody in this world. We're all worthwhile human beings for sure. But I give myself a running commentary. If I take myself out on a date, I'll say, how you doing, buddy? You're having a good time and whatever. And so oftentimes my clients say to me, well, how many times should I do it? I always say, well, start with 1 million, and then reevaluate. Again, for somebody that's spent a lifetime beating up with themselves, a couple positive affirmations aren't going to make any difference. This has to be a way of life.
Well, it has to be a new neural pathway.
Exactly.
And the only way to do that is through repetition and practice, right?
Exactly.
It has to become habit.
So we need to talk to ourselves continually. We need to know that we're inherently worthwhile, period. Regardless of how our parents treated us, regardless of the mistakes we made, we're all worthwhile. I believe that on a very deep level. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't be held accountable for their behavior. It doesn't mean that some people aren't more dangerous to society than others, but we're all worthwhile. We don't have to earn it. I had a client years ago who had a lifetime of depression, and she felt like there was a black cloud over her. And at the end of our first session, I said, could you please try on the belief this coming week that you're lovable and worthwhile just as you are? And I still remember the tear coming down her cheeks, and she said, I'll try, but it takes a lot of focus to be able to do that. It takes a lot of positive self-care. Mm-hmm. I love the idea of taking great care of ourselves physically, emotionally. I encourage people not to overly project their emotional needs onto other people. But along with being our own best friend, I think probably massive appreciation of everything, every good thing we have in our life is one of the other major pillars. I heard Rick Hansen, who wrote the Rewiring Our Buddha Brain years ago. I heard him speak at a conference down in Maryland. And he said, look, we all know to appreciate what we have in life. Just do more of it. And I drove home. It's about a 2.5-hour drive. I appreciated everything. Every time I pressed down on the accelerator, my car went forward. Every bridge, every tree. It may sound corny. I could have floated home. I tried to massively appreciate just the fact that I'm alive. I'm part of the game. I have the ability to appreciate a beautiful fall day or, all the.
And what does that? What kind of feeling does that generate on the inside of you when you're able to practice that gratitude?
It's magical. First of all, it gets me out of my head. As I said earlier, I'm really big into the mindfulness stuff. So many people think they can think their way to happiness and peace, particularly really bright people. We can think our way to the moon and back and maybe solve complicated math problems. We can't think our way to happiness. Happiness really is about appreciating those little things, what we're smelling, feeling, tasting, experiencing. It's just, it feels magical. It's hard to put any other word onto it. I walk my daughter down to her bus every morning, and we live in the woods, and I walk back very slowly. I just appreciate the woods, the smells, the mushrooms, the birds. I try to do that all the time. And every morning I wake up, I look in the mirror and I think, wow, it's another day to be useful to people, to be good to myself. Mm-hmm. It's tremendous. And it gets us out of our heads. It's hard to appreciate the moment we're in and be ruminating about something somebody said to us last week, or how our alcoholic father said we never amount to anything in life. We can't sometimes make the trauma go away, but when we're totally focused on the moment, it really gets us out of our head, obviously. I'm not the first person to say.
I really like this concept. I want you to cover it a little bit more because we're getting towards the end. But I want you to talk about this concept of all the ways that people treated you in the past, including the bad ways, the good ways. There, it says more about them than it does about you. And we tend to mentally, emotionally take it on as something that we did. We develop beliefs based on those behaviors, right?
Absolutely. I am very, very emphatic with people. I tell them flat out, you are in no way responsible for the treatment that you received. I say it over and over. A half hour after our son came to live with us, he was upset about something, and he went up and started crying on his bed, and and he'd had a lot of trauma. And I just looked at him and I said, buddy, I said, you're worthwhile and lovable, period. And you're not responsible for the bad treatment that you received. And he actually looked up and said, like, really? Nobody ever said that to him before. Sometimes we need to say that to people.
It's really profound.
I think if somebody comes in depressed and distraught, I'm not going to say, well, tell me how you feel. I mean, I might say that a little bit, but I'm more likely to say to them, if they say I feel terrible about myself because my parents yelled and screamed at me, I'll say very clearly that had nothing to do with you. There's no child in the history of the universe, the history of the world, that ever is responsible for the bad treatment they receive. Zero. I can be pretty persuasive. I'm sure you can too. I mean, people are stunned. People are stunned by that.
What are the implications if we do the positive stuff too in that? Have we taken erroneous opinions of ourselves based on all the actions that everyone has ever, if we grew up in a loving family and maybe we got too grandiose about certain, I don't know. I don't have an opinion there, but it's interesting to think about all the labels, all the beliefs. We take for granted all the world views that we have about the world and the way the world works, and we internalize all of it for good or bad.
Yes.
And even the good side? I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. Is even the good side good for us, or should we just start to see life more clearly?
I love the idea of seeing it clearly. It is what it is. There's good and bad, up and down. And I often encourage clients, once we've identified their beliefs, to ask them again, how well is it working for you? And to try on new beliefs. But I think it's to be realistic. The life, most days have good things, have bad things, but not to define ourselves by those things. I love the freedom of knowing I can always try on new beliefs. If beliefs are working for us, great. But whenever we feel out of sorts, we feel cranky, we feel, most of the time, at least I can identify some underlying belief system, whether it's I'm overly controlling or perfectionism, or I'm over personalizing stuff, or I'm too thin-skinned. And I'll simply say to myself, what belief do I want to try on? And I say that to my clients all the time. And that's the untethered soul. That's emotional freedom to me. It's knowing I have the ability to make that choice. It's Viktor Frankl that saying it when he was in the Holocaust in Man's Search for Meaning. He realized the only thing the Nazis couldn't take away from him was his ability to be a loving, compassionate person and find inner peace within himself. That's ultimate freedom, is knowing we can choose our beliefs. We can choose our perceptions of the world.
It speaks very profoundly to the power of attention. Whatever
Absolutely.
we put our attention on becomes our reality. Right?
Exactly.
How powerful our perceptions are.
Exactly.
But even more important than perceptions, our willingness to attend to what the more beneficial side of life, whatever's truly benefiting me more. That's a kind of a form of selfishness, if you will. But
right.
It's not. It's, I like, I just realized this in the book, how, a lot of what you're saying, it kind of runs alongside of, and don't gasp. I don't want anybody to gasp, because Ayn Rand, when she uses the term selfishness, she talks about selfishness as a virtue. She understands the word selfish a lot differently than, mainstream sees selfish. And we've already covered it in great detail. We can't give nearly as much to the world if we're half full. And I think that's her guiding principle was that one must manifest a serious concern for one's own interest if one is to lead a healthy, purposeful, fulfilling life. And it's some people find her work controversial, but I think there's a underlying essence here that is fundamental to inner happiness, which is what we've been talking about for the last 46 minutes.
Right.
So, Nate, I hope you'd be willing to come back on, because
Sure.
You've got a lot of great insights, and I love just kind of perusing the different areas of the mind and inner peace. Can you tell the listeners maybe two biggest blocks that you think or can come up with to inner peace, 2 blocks to inner peace. And then we'll talk about 2 of your biggest suggestions to gain inner peace.
Yes. I would say number 1, if people do not have self-compassion, it's very difficult for them to go inside themselves because all they do is see their pain or their self-criticism, their self-judgment. They don't want to venture inward. They become frenetic. They become workaholic. They maybe get into addictions or disruptive behaviors. Inner peace for me is a journey within. And when I go in there, it has to feel good. It has to feel comfortable. It has to feel emotionally safe. And that's where the self-compassion comes in. People who hate themselves, people that are constantly criticizing and putting themselves down, do not have inner peace. How could they possibly? They don't want to look within. It's just filled with all their inner demons. So we have to create a template for our inner selves that's filled with everything we've been talking about today. So that would be number 1. I think, again, number 2 would be people feel as if they are inner peace, if they were peaceful inside, they would be lethargic or would lack motivation. People feel like they need to drive themselves with judgments or perfectionism or unrealistic expectations. People feel that somehow inner peace will slow them down. And the opposite is true. I love to go sit in the woods, but I can feel peaceful driving in New York City. I can feel peaceful walking across campus on a busy day teaching at Temple. I can feel peaceful at any point, hopefully. This isn't about inactivity. This isn't about being spaced out or acting stoned or acting, like without a care. This is about being tuned in to the moment. You could go sit on a mountaintop in Tibet and be filled with anxiety and self-hatred. So I think those are the 2 of the biggest things. The lack of self-compassion makes it difficult to go within, and the fear that if we're peaceful, somehow we're missing out or people will think we're not in the game. I think that drives people away. And I guess the third thing would be people just haven't learned the skills to get there. People haven't practiced meditation. They really need a template, as you say. They need to learn how to do it. I'm not a great mathematician. If I wanted to be a mathematician, I'd go talk to a math teacher. People like you and me, hopefully, have thought about this stuff, and we can be guides. We can sort of take people by the hand, and our spirits can walk together, and we can show people. And it means that we have to be as peaceful and happy as we can be. If you're a miserable therapist, how are you going to help anybody else, find happiness?
Exactly. Yeah, I love that because this InnerZention is not at all about finding the right or the one kind of meditation so that you can quit your job and just do that the rest of your life and never have to deal with another angry person again. But this is the real world. This is the Western society, which is go, go, go. But it's not even that much. It's about moving towards your life mission, being productive with your gifts, all the while having the confidence and the inner peace to get that done and not be too sidetracked with, these bad feelings, bad emotions, the anger, the triggers to the past, the trauma, etc. So if I can do it with these full days and you can do it over a period of 40 years, with all that you've got going on and all the teaching and seminars and getting ready and nervousness and all that, that's kind of the target that we're doing is getting it all done, but in a state of inner peace.
Exactly.
So I think you said it really well.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nate. Boy, we went really long, but I really appreciate you being here and sharing your excellent service to humanity with the rest of us and your ideas, and certainly that book of yours. I hope that all of you pick up his book and read through it. It very much is an important aspect to inner peace, which is self-compassion, self-acceptance, and is probably the main gate to get to the inner world.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored. Very much enjoyed our conversation.
Already looking forward to the next one.
Okay.
Thanks. All right.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.